She stood by his storms, and in the quiet of her faith, he became her shelter. The first time he saw her, it was almost by accident. He had been rushing down the crowded city street, shoulders hunched, hands buried in the pockets of his worn jacket, mind weighed down by the invisible storm of his own thoughts. At 25, he carried the kind of quiet frustration that didn't announce itself, the kind that settled deep in the chest and made the world feel heavier than it needed to be. She appeared across the street, graceful even in the chaos of pedestrians and honking cars. She was 42, her presence deliberate but effortless. Her hair, streaked lightly with silver, caught the afternoon sunlight, and the subtle scent of jasmine trailed behind her. He noticed the ease with which she moved, the calm certainty in her posture, and for a fleeting moment, it was as if the noise of the city dimmed. Their worlds collided briefly inside a small cafe the next morning. He had slipped in to escape the drizzle, hoping for nothing more than a quiet corner and a cup of coffee. Yet there she was, already there, reviewing papers, her pen moving thoughtfully, her brow slightly furrowed in concentration. He hesitated near the counter, scanning for a seat, when a sudden creak of a chair pulled his attention. She looked up, their eyes meeting just long enough to hold something unspoken. Curiosity, recognition, a subtle spark. When he finally sat, he chose the table across from her, pretending it was coincidence, though he couldn't help stealing glances. She noticed, too, not in a teasing or judgmental way, but with a gentle awareness. The quiet rhythm of her actions, the soft sip of her coffee, the way her fingers lingered on the cup as though grounding herself, drew his attention without effort. Then came the moment that lodged itself in memory, a brief, accidental touch. Her arm brushed his as she reached for a sugar jar, and the contact was electric in its subtlety. Not the kind that shouted desire, but the kind that whispered connection. His heart thumped in that still, tiny space of the cafe, awareness sharpening around the simple reality that someone, this woman, older, composed, undeniably alive, had noticed him. He felt seen in a way that startled him. Neither spoke beyond polite greetings, yet in that shared, fleeting proximity, something shifted. She smiled softly, a hint of warmth tugging at the edges of her eyes, while he offered a small, awkward nod, suddenly aware of how tightly he had been holding himself together for years. In that quiet, human moment, the story began. The slow, delicate weaving of two lives that on the surface seemed mismatched, yet underneath hummed with the same frequency of longing and loneliness. And so it began, a chance encounter, a brush of hands, and a glance that lingered too long. She would come to be his quiet anchor, though he had no inkling of it yet. He would come to be her safe harbor, though she had long forgotten the need for one. But in the soft, ordinary collision of their worlds, the first threads of something extraordinary began to take hold. Fragile, subtle, and entirely irresistible. After that first accidental encounter, their worlds seemed to orbit closer, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't deliberate. It was the quiet magnetism of familiarity drawing them together. He found himself back in the cafe more often, always at a small table by the window, though he told himself it was for the view. She noticed, of course, with that soft, knowing smile that never felt intrusive. It made him feel seen without pressure, like someone understood the invisible battles he carried. Their conversations began small. At first, it was about mundane things, the weather, the barista's new pastry, the stubborn drip of the coffee machine. But even in those trivial exchanges, there was a current, subtle and warming. When she spoke, her voice was steady, calm, a soothing counterpoint to the chaos he often felt inside. When he responded, he realized he was more deliberate, more attentive, trying to match her patience without understanding why. One afternoon, as rain poured outside, he lingered longer than usual, nursing a lukewarm coffee. She noticed his hands shaking slightly from the chill, and without a word, slid a scarf across the table toward him. Their fingers brushed when he accepted it, and a shiver ran through him, not from the cold, but from the quiet intimacy of the gesture. She didn't say anything, just offered a gentle smile that held more weight than any words could convey. As the days passed, they began taking small walks together after coffee, often silent at first, letting the world speak around them. The sound of their footsteps on wet pavement, the faint hum of distant traffic, even the smell of damp earth became part of their shared rhythm. He noticed how she moved with confidence, her posture relaxed yet dignified. She noticed how he carried a subtle tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided eye contact when thoughts grew too heavy. Physical gestures became their secret language. A light touch on the arm to emphasize a point, the way she adjusted the collar of his coat as a breeze swept through, the casual brushing of fingers when passing a book back and forth, each small act deepened a connection that neither rushed nor named. They were learning each other's boundaries, and in doing so, they were creating a safe space, an emotional sanctuary, however fragile. Even their laughter became a bridge. He found himself smiling more easily, the tension around his chest loosening just in her presence. And she, in turn, allowed herself rare moments of lightheartedness, catching glimpses of a vulnerability she rarely let anyone see. The age difference mattered only in the quiet understanding that life had shaped them differently. He with raw intensity, she with tempered grace. Yet it became a compliment rather than a barrier. By the time they parted that rainy afternoon, standing under the awning with the city dripping around them, there was a silent acknowledgement. Something significant had begun. Neither said it aloud, and yet both carried it in the soft awareness of lingering glances and the gentle hesitations before stepping back into their separate worlds. A connection had formed, tentative, unspoken, and profoundly human. One that would slowly, inexorably, grow into the shelter they both would one day find in each other. Life, he realized, had a way of testing even the quietest hearts. Just as their connection began to settle into something comforting, his personal storm grew fiercer. A failed project at work, a harsh critique he hadn't anticipated, the gnawing voice of self-doubt. It all came crashing together, leaving him withdrawn and tense. He became a shadow of himself, moving through the days in a fog of quiet frustration, afraid to show the chaos to anyone, especially her. But she noticed. That's what made her different. She didn't ask questions that demanded answers. She simply observed. She noticed the subtle tightening of his shoulders, the way his hands lingered a moment too long over his coffee cup, the hollow pause in his laughter. One afternoon, she found him sitting alone on a park bench, hands tucked into his coat, eyes fixed on the rain pooling around his shoes. Without speaking, she sat beside him. The space between them was comfortable, yet charged, a delicate tension neither wanted to disturb. The wind tousled her hair, and he found himself watching the way it fell across her cheek, the serene expression that seemed impossible to achieve in his own life. She didn't offer solutions, didn't try to fix what he wasn't ready to confront. She simply existed there, steady and present, and that quiet presence began to soothe the storm he had been carrying. Her hand brushed lightly against his as she adjusted her scarf against the chill, and he flinched slightly, not from discomfort, but from the intensity of awareness. Every small gesture mattered. The tilt of her head as she listened, the way her eyes softened when she looked at him, the subtle warmth radiating from her mere proximity. It was as though the world outside could rage on, and yet, in that small space, he could breathe. He tried to retreat, to push her away, convinced she didn't need the burden of his troubles. But she leaned in slightly, her shoulder grazing his, a silent insistence that he didn't have to face everything alone. Her presence wasn't loud or forceful. It was patient, steady, and entirely disarming. Slowly, he allowed himself to speak, first in fragments, then in sentences about what was weighing him down, about the failures he could not escape, about the fear that he wasn't enough. She listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, her eyes steady and unjudging. When he faltered, her hand found his again, the lightest touch that somehow said more than words ever could. He felt a strange sensation, not relief exactly, but a sense of being held, of being seen, of being understood in a way that made the chaos outside less threatening. By the time the rain stopped, the tension in his chest had eased slightly, replaced by a fragile sense of connection. He realized that her strength wasn't in solving his storms, but in standing beside them with him. And in that quiet companionship, a new understanding took root. Some people are shelters not because they remove the storms, but because they make it possible to endure them together. In that moment, he glimpsed the depth of her patience, her empathy, and the quiet power of her presence. And he understood that whatever came next, he was no longer facing the storm alone. The first time he let his walls truly fall, it wasn't in a grand confession or dramatic moment. It was quiet, unassuming, a vulnerability he hadn't shown anyone, even himself, until that evening. He had invited her over under the guise of sharing a casual dinner. Yet the tension in his shoulders and the nervous rhythm of his hands betrayed more than he intended. She noticed immediately, as she always did. They settled on the couch after eating, the room warm with the soft glow of a single lamp. Outside, the city hummed with distant traffic, but inside, there was only the quiet rhythm of two lives brushing close. He began in fragments, hesitant sentences that faltered under the weight of their meaning. He spoke of regrets he had carried since youth, choices that haunted him, moments when he had doubted himself so deeply he felt adrift. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer quick fixes. Instead, she leaned slightly closer, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the couch, near enough that her presence was tangible but not imposing. Her eyes, calm and unwavering, invited him to continue. With every word, he felt his defenses loosen, the armor he had spent years building softening under her steady, patient gaze. At one point, he paused, ashamed of the rawness in his voice. She tilted her head gently, letting a strand of hair fall behind her ear. As he spoke, she reached out and let her hand rest lightly over his. It was not dramatic, not overbearing, but it grounded him. He could feel the warmth of her skin, the steady pressure that said, without words, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, he allowed himself to lean slightly toward her. He noticed the softness in her expression, the faint glimmer of concern and warmth in her eyes, and felt a stirring he hadn't anticipated, a blend of trust, admiration, and an unspoken desire to protect this fragile bond. By the time he finally sank back into the cushions, exhaustion mingled with relief. He understood something fundamental. She was not just a witness to his storms. She was learning their rhythm, standing beside him with a calm presence that made the chaos bearable. In that gentle, YouTube-safe intimacy, a hand on a shoulder, a gaze that held meaning, a slight brush of fingers, the first real walls began to crumble. And with them, the first hint of something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable, began to emerge. Life, he realized slowly, wasn't just about surviving his own storms. Sometimes it was about noticing when someone else's sky was overcast and quietly stepping in. She had always been his anchor, her steady presence calming the turbulence he carried. But now, he began to see that she, too, carried weight, responsibilities, expectations, and moments of quiet solitude that few ever breached. It happened subtly, one evening in her apartment. She had returned from a long day at work, her posture slightly stooped, her expression tense. The usually composed lines of her face seemed a little softer, more vulnerable. He noticed immediately the way her shoulders sagged as she hung her coat, the faint sigh that escaped her lips. He didn't need to ask. He simply moved closer, holding a mug of tea he had made for her. She looked at him, startled by the gesture, then softened. "You didn't have to," she began, but he cut her off gently with a shake of his head. "I know," he said. "I just thought you might like it." No words of advice, no trying to solve her problems, only a presence that was calm, steady, and unjudging. He watched her relax slightly, her fingers curling around the warm cup, the tension in her jaw loosening. As they sat together, the space between them charged with subtle intimacy, he realized how naturally the roles had shifted. She had once been the unwavering shelter. Now, he was learning to offer her the same comfort, the same reassurance that had kept him anchored. His hand brushed hers when he reached for his cup, a deliberate, gentle contact that spoke volumes without words. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers lingered momentarily, an acknowledgement of the unspoken connection growing between them. Later, as they moved to the living room, he suggested a quiet walk on her balcony. The night was calm, the city lights twinkling in the distance, and the cool air carried the faint scent of evening blooms. He stood behind her, close enough that their shoulders touched lightly, letting her lean against him as they looked out over the skyline. The warmth of his presence was subtle but grounding, a gentle reminder that she was no longer carrying her burdens alone. They laughed softly over small memories, shared observations about the night, and occasionally, in that gentle, unforced rhythm, their fingers brushed again. Each time, the spark of connection deepened, though it remained unspoken, tender, and YouTube-safe. The age difference, once a quiet backdrop, now felt like a natural harmony, her patience and calm blending with his earnest attentiveness and quiet intensity. By the end of the evening, as she finally turned toward him, he offered a small, steady hand on her back, and she leaned into the gesture naturally, almost instinctively. They both understood that love wasn't just about grand declarations. It was in the quiet presence, the small acts of care, the mutual shelter built in shared spaces. And in that moment, he realized with quiet satisfaction that he had become not only her confidant but her anchor. The storm had shifted. Together, they were no longer navigating it alone. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world seemed to pause and the gentle hum of the city outside faded into a soft backdrop. They had settled into her living room, the air carrying the faint aroma of tea and old books. The lamplight cast a warm glow across the room, illuminating the lines of her face and the subtle sparkle in her eyes. He watched her as she spoke softly about her day, and for the first time, he felt a desire not just to be near her, but to truly know her in every quiet nuance. The conversation drifted naturally, as it often did, from work frustrations to fleeting childhood memories. Then, without any fanfare, he admitted something he had never said aloud, the fear that he wasn't enough, not for anyone, not even himself. His voice trembled slightly, betraying the vulnerability he had worked so hard to conceal. She didn't recoil or offer trite reassurances. She simply leaned a little closer, her hand resting lightly on his forearm, her presence steady, patient, and entirely grounding. "I've always seen you," she whispered, not as a correction, but as a gentle acknowledgement, even when you couldn't see yourself. The simplicity of her words, the calm weight behind them, unraveled something inside him he hadn't realized was taut for so long. He felt the tension in his chest ease, the tight knot of fear loosening in a way that was almost physical. She reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair behind his ear, her fingers lingering just enough to make him aware of the quiet intimacy of the moment. He felt drawn toward her, the pull not urgent, not desperate, but deliberate, a recognition of trust, of connection, of something deeper than attraction. For the first time, he allowed himself to lean into her, resting a shoulder lightly against hers. The contact was fleeting but weighty, a grounding presence that reassured him he wasn't alone. She responded in kind, her hand moving to rest gently over his. The warmth of her touch, the softness in her gaze, and the steady rhythm of her breathing spoke more than words ever could. In the silence that followed, they communicated volumes, mutual understanding, unspoken affection, and the realization that they had become safe spaces for each other. There was no rush, no sudden confession of love. Instead, it was in the quiet, in the subtle shifts of proximity, the shared glances that lingered a heartbeat too long, the gentle brush of fingers. He realized that this was what love felt like at its most profound, not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but a steady, unshakable presence in someone else's life. As the night deepened, they sat side by side, occasionally exchanging words, more often sharing silence. He traced a small circle on the back of her hand, feeling the warmth and steadiness beneath his fingertips. She leaned into him slightly, a soft sigh escaping her lips, the kind that spoke of trust, comfort, and a willingness to be seen fully. In that quiet, tender space, both of them understood. They had found something rare and enduring. He had become her shelter, not through heroics, but through consistency and care. And she had become his storm's constant, the anchor that allowed him to breathe. The moment wasn't explosive. It was simply real, profound, and irrevocable. The morning sun spilled gently through the sheer curtains, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. It was a quiet Saturday, the kind where time seems to stretch, giving space for reflection and stillness. They were together, not in the chaos of a storm or the tension of struggle, but in a rare, calm moment that reflected everything they had quietly built over weeks and months. He watched her across the small breakfast table, the way her hair caught the light, softening the lines of her face in a way that made her appear even more graceful than usual. She smiled at him, eyes crinkling at the corners, a warmth in her gaze that spoke of deep trust and comfort. No words were necessary. The quiet glance between them carried all the weight of shared experiences, late-night confessions, and countless small acts of care that had forged this bond. Their hands met across the table, fingers intertwining naturally, a gentle pressure that was both grounding and exhilarating. He felt the solidity of her presence, the warmth of her skin against his, and realized fully how far they had come. From accidental encounters and tentative glances to a space where silence itself could be intimate, comforting, and profound. Later, they walked together along the nearby park path, the crisp air carrying faint scents of winter blooms. He fell in a step beside her, matching her pace, occasionally brushing lightly against her arm or allowing their shoulders to touch. She leaned into those moments with ease, the unspoken understanding that they had become each other's refuge. He, who had once feared vulnerability, now found joy in being the quiet support she could lean on, the shelter she deserved. Small gestures marked the depth of their connection, sharing a scarf when the wind picked up, laughing softly over an inside joke, leaning together on a park bench as the city stirred around them. Each moment reinforced the truth they had both come to accept. Love was not loud, not dramatic, not measured in declarations, but in presence, in patience, in the consistency of care and attention. By the afternoon, they returned to her apartment, settling into the familiar comfort of the living room. He offered a gentle cheek kiss as she passed, a quiet affirmation rather than a statement, and she responded by resting her head briefly on his shoulder. In that simple exchange, there was the culmination of their journey, trust fully given, hearts fully opened, and a love matured through understanding and mutual shelter. As evening fell, they lingered together by the window, watching the city lights blink awake. His arm found its way around her shoulders, her hand slipping into his. There was no urgency, no need to speak. The rhythm of their breathing, the warmth of their bodies leaning into one another, and the shared calm of the moment conveyed everything. They had weathered storms, his and hers, and emerged on the other side stronger, closer, and more whole than either could have anticipated. In each other, they had found safety, affection, and a profound sense of belonging. The story did not end with fireworks or dramatic confessions. It ended with quiet certainty, with love spoken through presence, patience, and unwavering care. Together, they had built a shared shelter, a home in each other's hearts. And in that home, they were finally irrevocably safe.